For those who don't know TII is an amalgamation of the National Roads Authority and the RPA, which is essentially the light rail system in Dublin. This evening's presentation is about our circular economy plan. And I think it's quite apt that you see in the background of this slide is a photograph of the Lewis, and it's over the Sean Houston Bridge. For anyone that's not that familiar with the layout in Dublin, the Sean Houston Bridge actually dates back to the 1820s. It was originally called the King's Bridge, and it served King's Station. And over the years, being only 9 meters wide, it was very constrained in terms of serving as a major artery into the centre of Dublin, and had been replaced, and for a while was more or less redundant. And when the Lewis came along, the Lewis was able to reuse and invent the need for this particular infrastructure. So starting then on the next slide, Janet, please. Just outline what the presentation format will be this evening. The Circular Economy Plan in TII is actually under development, so it hasn't been finally formalized at the moment. However, we'll bring you through the definition, and that's a very important aspect of it. We'll look at layers for change. We'll look at the project phases of the development of the plan. And we look then at some pilot projects that are helping to formulate the plan. And finally, we'll wrap up with the way forward and the next steps. So the next slide, Jennifer, thank you. So in terms of Transport Infrastructure Ireland, we actually are there for a particular purpose. And when we were the National Roads Authority, it was a very simple mantra. We were there to have a safe system of national roads. But you can see in our recently released strategy document, we now have looked again at redefined our purpose. You can see there that the purpose is now widening beyond the idea of it simply being an asset to being a national asset. And it's one that's going to impact not just on the economy, it's also going to look at society and also looking at the environment. So if you look at it and you look at the vision that we have now, it has three overarching aims: sustainable transport infrastructure, which is quite obvious. We need it to be safe and resilient, which again is quite obvious. But maybe not quite so obvious, the third strand is that we have to make sure that it meets the needs of our stakeholders. And to be able to do that, we need to have a value in our people, in our customers, and in our partners. Next slide, Janet, please. When TII is actually looking at developing this strategy, it was quite obvious that we needed to look at some of the external and internal influences. And external would have been the likes of EU policy and the Irish legislation that would have evolved from that. So you can see in terms of the strategy document, there's a three-phase approach. We're looking at the economy, we're looking at society, and we're looking at the environment. And what you can also see from this slide is, again, I mentioned our partners and our stakeholders. We have to look at it in terms of a wider context than just the road and the light rail. Where does that fit in the environment? Where does it fit in the community? And where does it fit in the economy? So I'm now just going to hand you over to Janet, and she'll take you forward with the next few slides.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm just going to run through European policy relating to circular economy and the context for circular economy in Ireland. So at the end of 2019, the European Union published the Green Deal. So essentially, this is the plan to make the EU's economy sustainable. It can be done by turning climate and environmental challenges into opportunities and making the transition just and inclusive for all. There's a stark statement at the start of the Green Deal, and it's also carried through into the Circular Economy Plan, and that's that 90% of biodiversity loss and 50% of carbon emissions are associated with resource extraction and production. The Green Deal commits to a climate law that will set the EU on course to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. It notes and aims to provide finance for just transition. In March of 2020, the Commission published the Circular Economy Action Plan 2020, and that was a key action that had been set out the previous year in the Green Deal. The key takeaways are to make sustainable products the norm in the European Union, to empower consumers to provide a true right to repair. It identified sectors that had the greatest potential for circularity and resource efficiency. And the key one of these for TII is construction and buildings. So the importance of the circular economy was set out in the Programme for Government, published last June. And key takeaways were the completion and implementation of the Waste Action Plan for a Circular Economy. And I'll come back to that in the next slide. The Programme for Government made quite a statement in relation to the circular economy. It committed to an all-of-government circular economy unit to support the transition of Ireland from a linear to a circular economy. It notes that the government will examine changes to the tax system to promote circularity, and it emphasises the importance of public procurement in the transition. It notes the importance of evidence-based approaches, for example, the use of environmental product declarations. In September of last year, the Waste Action Plan for a Circular Economy was published by DCCAE. So the waste sector is just one part of the circular economy, but this plan set out 200 actions. It was very ambitious to support the transition from a linear to a circular economy and to ensure that materials and products remain in productive use for longer. Some of the actions include making producers who manufacture and sell disposable goods for profit environmentally accountable for the placing of those products on the market and their impacts. It notes the need to plan for construction and demolition waste management at the earliest possible stage in a construction and demolition project. We'll come back to that later. And it notes that the importance of supporting sustainable economic models. For example, the use of recycled materials over virgin materials. And so now I'm going to hand over to Mike Evans.
So just to talk a little bit about what circular economy as a strategy would mean. So what we've devised is a 9R categorization of circularity, where we start at increasing principles of circularity and move down through those where it becomes the potential is less taken. So tonight, if time's gone by, we would have all traveled to Clyde Road to give this presentation. I suppose that's an example of you can take an alternative strategy in terms of transport. Maybe you don't need to travel or enable that travel in the first place, and therefore you don't need to construct additional transport infrastructure. And another example of that is that apart from working online, if you develop your economy and your planning and your cities in a compact way, then you also reduce the ultimate amount of travel required, and people get to travel in a more sustainable way as well, compared with dispersed growth. Another thing that's much more interesting, and Tom referred to it in his opening statement, is sometimes we can take a form of an existing asset and make its use more intense. So if you put light rail onto a road network, actually you're carrying more people. If you're upgrading a radial route coming into a city and you devise a way to get more people into buses and provide priority for long range buses, you're making the use of the road more intense and getting more value out of what you already have. And it's only then when we get to actually implement new projects that we actually begin to think, well, maybe we can use less material in the construction of those projects. So we look at minimizing our amount of earthworks, reducing the amount of imported material, and trying to make more use out of what we already have as we're excavating on a transport project. And then we move down through the other more typical butterfly elements of circularity, where we try to reuse those elements that we're taking off our asset, make sure we don't discard them, make sure they're kept in good repair, moving on to R4, so that we keep the asset in use for longer, and then restore it, bring it up to date. very interesting to see us in some parts where we're actually removing existing bridges at the end of their lifespan, refurbishing that deck span for large steel bridges, for example, and putting them back into use, repaired and repurposed for the next 40 years. And then we move on down into making sure that we're using materials, for example, keep them at a high grade rather than a low grade. And then at the very end of that cycle, we're making sure that going and trying to get energy recovery from a material is the last possible option that we would look at. Next slide, Janet, please. Some people, I always find it interesting, you relate circularity to sustainability and the Sustainable Development Goals. How do they interact? This is what we've prepared in terms of trying to explain that the SDGs strongly and directly benefit from TII having circular economy practices, and we show the ones that are relevant there. And then there are SDGs that indirectly benefit from TII's circular economy practices. And then thinking about it again is that the SDGs themselves benefit how circularity can be implemented. And I particularly highlight 17, partnership, because we need to do all of these things together. I'll be back to you, Janet.
Thanks, Mike. So circular economy is a three-pronged strategy. So there's three key aspects on TII's activities and projects that we're looking at. As a material and design strategy, some of the tools that will enable circularity are designed for deconstruction and flexibility, designed for off-site construction. This reduces the 15% of materials imported to sites, for example, that are natural wastage. Use of cradle-to-cradle material and products that have a second life. Design for waste-efficient procurement. Design for reuse and recovery, and design for materials optimization. The result of implementing these strategies is a reduction in resource consumption, a reduction in cost, and life extension of your assets, components, and materials. The second prong of the approach is circular economy as a business strategy. The emphasis for business is on capturing the residual value of, again, your assets, materials, and components. The flexibility of assets. During the life of an asset, for example, can you avoid it becoming obsolete or redundant? Through ensuring at design stage that that asset is more flexible and serves a number of uses. Performance procurement, and we'll come back to that shortly in terms of pavement design, the relocatability of assets, and products as a service. The results of implementing these strategies is the creation of value, keeping assets in use at their highest value, and systemic change. The third aspect of circular economy is life cycle assessment. Some aspects of life cycle assessment are shown on this slide. The use of environmental product declarations, and TII and Arup are members of the Irish Green Building Council commitment to implementing environmental product declarations. Human toxicity potential, for example, is a metric that can be used as part of life cycle assessment. Embodied and whole life carbon can be considered. In terms of value, viewing your capital expenditure as an investment rather than a once-off payment. The consideration of maintenance and the consideration of user cost and user value and reducing those costs. The result of implementing these strategies are benefits to human health, benefits to the environment, and a whole life return on your financial investment. So the three-pronged approach that's proposed is a material and design strategy, a business strategy, and the use of life cycle assessment. The graphic that's on the screen at the moment is commonly used throughout Europe to communicate the 4 circular business models that would be key to a transition to a circular economy. And it's known as the value hill. In the center of the diagram is shown the life of a product or an asset. On the left-hand side of the value hill is the value that's added at each stage of a product or asset's life. Materials are mined, they're manufactured, they're added in construction, labor is added. At the top of the value hill is where you'd like your asset or component to stay in terms of value. On the right-hand side is what currently happens at the end of its first life. Attempts can be made to maintain the use of the asset, to reuse it as it is. It can be broken out into its components, which can be reused at their current usage, or it could be broken into components and recycled. What you want to avoid at all times is the disposal or the loss of the value or the utility in that asset. So the business models are summarized in terms of circular design models. These are implemented during design phase in the early life of the asset. An example would be implementing design for deconstruction. The green at the top of the screen models are optimal use models. Examples of optimal use models are asset sharing, or for example, products as a service. An exemplar of this would be the Philips Signify lighting as a service offering. It's in use in a number of airports and a number of roads and streets projects around the world. Philips offer lighting as a service. They maintain ownership of the luminaires. These luminaires can be modular, reused in a second or a third life, and the user purchases lighting as a service. So Philips assert that this is a 40% cost saving to the user. Value recovery models are on the right-hand side, and these look at maximizing the reuse of the material and the components within your asset at the end of its first life. Circular support models are any virtual support that support the other three models. Examples are material sharing platforms or any of the financial incentives for circular economy the EU, for example, are introducing. There's a British standard for circular economy in organizations, BS 8001, and it sets out the 6 key principles of the circular economy, which align very much with the approach that TII is taking. So stewardship is a key one of these, innovation required to introduce circular business models, the use of systems thinking in mapping the ecosystem and the various different stakeholders and actors within circular economy systems, the importance of collaboration between TII and its supply chain and stakeholders, value optimization along the supply chain, and transparency of its endeavors.
So let's talk a little bit about what circular economy is going to mean for TII. So the image on the screen at the moment is from the UK Construction Board, and it maps the potential for carbon reduction as you proceed through the length of a project. And it is what we always say, the opportunity is always greatest the earlier you start. So at planning stage, you can make choices about whether you need to build something. You can challenge whether the root cause of the need and explore what are the alternative approaches to achieve what you're trying to do. You can make decisions about building less early on. And then as you move through the design phases, as you get into more detailed design, you can begin to think about how to use materials in a better way, how to streamline delivery production, and get to that minimizing of resource consumption. And then it's when you begin to construct, that's when you begin to think about build efficiently. And it's this point is that applying circular economy when you go to a construction site, you've missed a huge amount of opportunity. And so if you could go to the next slide, Janet. So those of you that work with TII will be familiar with the phase 1 to phase 7 way of approaching a project. When we set out at an early stage, what is the working definition we wanted to use for circular economy? So it's an economy that is restorative and regenerative design, which aims to keep assets, components, and materials at their highest utility and value at all times, sweating of assets and re-engineering of business systems. So what we've done is we've taken that traditional phase 1 to 7 approach of delivering a project and reimagined it as a circular delivery process, where we start at phase 0, we work our way through the planning phases, working through to phase 4. We get to enabling procurement, and we begin to think that when the project has been delivered, we need to consider that we want to be thinking deeply about how it's going to be operated and maintained, how it might have to be upgraded in the future, and bring that into our initial thinking, and then understanding that hopefully it won't be decommissioned. And if it is decommissioned, what will happen to it? If you could go to the next slide, Janet. One of the things that we've done is we've taken Stuart Brandt's approach of the layers approach to buildings and apply that to infrastructure, because we need to balance our tendency to design as infrastructure engineers things that are very durable and make them last for a very long time, with the need to consider their reusability and whether they need to last for that very long time. So the principle of is you describe the layers, things that don't last very long are on the outside, and things that do last for a very long time are on the inside. The things on the outside are more easily changed and can therefore be more easily reused. So thinking about material that won't last for a very long time or is frequently replaced as the stuff, they're those items for a road scheme that would be next to the carriageway, for example, lighting, road marking, signage. Moving further into the road, we think about the skin. So for a road, the skin is more obvious. Maybe it's the wearing course and the verge material, those things that are replaced routinely as they wear out. We think about shallow surfaces. And so these are things that we don't want to be in places that we have to, if we need to get at them, we don't want to be taking material out that should be lasting a much longer time. We need to position them very carefully. And then we get into those things that will begin to last for much longer, the deep surfaces, they're lasting for a much longer time, and the road structure itself. And of course, the site is the thing that lasts the longest. If you could flip on to the next slide, Janet. And then just thinking about how that would apply in a railway context. So if you're thinking about a metro, obviously the tunnel is something that will last for a very long time, but those elements of the metro system that are dealing with the train itself are going to be replaced much more frequently. And then applying that onto a light rail scheme, for example, the stuff is those things that are visible to us all. They're the catenary system, for example, and then you have the various layers of the light rail structure in the same way that you would have it with a road scheme. And if you could go to the next slide, Janet. So what we did next is we began to explore these topics in a series of workshops with the internal people in TII, the stakeholders, and what are the things that are important to get a strategy that will work. So we considered asset management. You know, TII as an asset management organization through a mindset and re-engineering can drive change. Procurement, the use of whole life costing in procurement, taking account of environmental and social criteria. Stakeholder engagement, TII can engage with the supply chain and other agencies to influence UN SDG implementation and vice versa. Life cycle asset, consider operation and maintenance at early project phases. So the design is considering how the asset will be maintained in a much more thorough way and use new and appropriate models that can strike a balance between economic and social costs. And information management, it's very important that we understand the materials that they flow through the system, a material passport type data gathering for assets and components and materials. But over all of that, we got to remember that what we're trying to do is we're trying to re-engineer something that is an existing system to ensure asset optimization is considered at the outset of projects, implementing layers design concept to enable design for deconstruction and ease of maintenance to lengthen asset life. So if you could flick to the next slide, Janet. So within that, what are the summaries of the findings? So just to back up again, that reimagining of the phases of a project and bringing in new additional phases of phase 8 and phase 9 that deal with the asset in use and its reuse of the materials. But over layering all of that is the issue of procurement and how procurement fits into the whole overall system. And whether you call it, sometimes it'll be called green procurement, circular procurement, and sustainable procurement indeed. So what are the opportunities then? Ensure asset optimization is considered a project outset where there is an existing asset. The use of whole life costing and procurement to include environmental and social criteria, and it is permitted if these are clear and transparent. Pilot projects, really important, as they can be used to roll out circular economy initiatives, and then those can be scaled up on other projects. Service models, and we've spoken about roads as a service, could be adopted to incentivize the industry to provide long-lasting and replaceable refurbishable products. What are the barriers? Cost is currently the main consideration in tendering and budget as opposed to value and investment. Time constraints and budget of procurement processes. Taking account of whole life cost and treating assets as an investment is likely to be financially beneficial. So back to you.
Thanks, Mike. So I'm just going to go through some of the benefits of implementing a circular economy approach. So these are value capture, so optimizing social, environmental, and economic value. Reducing carbon, so 50% of carbon emissions, it's estimated, result from resource extraction and production. Reducing consumption of unsustainable resources. It improves the resilience of your supply chain. So in times like COVID and Brexit, by creating more loops and sharing materials between projects and increasing recycled content, for example, you're making your supply chain more resilient. The reduction of environmental impact and negative externalities. Reducing regulatory and planning risk by understanding the flow of materials and communicating this data. Biodiversity, as I mentioned at the outset, the Green Deal identifies 90% of biodiversity loss is linked to resource extraction and production. Circular business models linked to innovation, and implementation of circular economy improves energy efficiency in your material system. In terms of value loss through workshops, we identified 5 key value loss areas for transport. These are the premature demolition and deterioration of assets, depreciated components. When you break out an asset, the residual value is estimated less than 5% of the value of a new manufactured product. The over-design of assets, and Tom Casey will discuss this shortly, where traditional linear design methods don't consider performance-based approach, for example. So Pavement is a pilot project we're undertaking to address this. Assets disposed of to landfill or recovery at the end of life, and the reducing space in infrastructure to allow for this, and underperforming assets. So 5 concept ideas. So the plan is in preparation at the moment. These are 5 concept ideas that we're developing to address those value loss points. They include design for deconstruction and longevity. So tackling the problem at design stage and removing it at the end of pipe. The use of sharing and collaboration platforms to facilitate data capture so that opportunities between projects, for example, can be identified. Innovation tenders and pilot projects to enable proof of concept. Products as a service or roads as a service, so new circular business models and a different kind of ownership. Incorporating circular economy principles into projects, and those will be started on a pilot basis and then, depending on the outcome, scaled up. So I'm going to hand over to Tom Casey now to discuss the pilot projects.
So if we're developing a plan, there are 2 key ways that we can help to develop, expedite that development. One of them is we can benchmark, and Janet has already referred to the fact that we've looked at other jurisdictions to see how they have brought it in. But anyone that has done research will definitely realize that the value of a real life project and looking at a case study and applying your theory to an actual practical environment, you can learn quite a lot. So the 3 case studies that we're looking at is the Irish Analytical Pavement Design Tool. And I suppose what that tells us is that we've actually looked at re-engineering how we will design our pavements. So back to a re-engineering, looking at, again, as Mike had said, how do we sweat the asset? Well, in the first instance, we have to size the asset appropriately. The other 2 case studies are one is from the light rail and the other is from the roads. Now, people might say there's quite a difference between them. Obviously there are, but if you look at it, the commonality and what we can actually learn from them, if you're looking at a light rail project, there's a key aspect to a light rail project, and that it is confined. It's constrained by its environment. You can't look at a wider scope. So for example, the Lewis in Dublin had to actually go through the city centre. And then that gave, I suppose, challenges that were there, and it also gave some opportunities, as we've seen from the very start, reusing some of the infrastructure that had become redundant. If we look at it then from a roads perspective, very much unconstrained in comparison to the Lewis, it means to say we can look at a totally different alignment. So we can learn from these 3 projects to see what is the best way that we can actually make a plan that gives the widest benefits. So next slide, Janet, please. If we're looking at the aspect of the Irish Analytical Pavement Design Method, it's now almost 6 years since we actually began this process. And in the first instance, we said, well, how do we actually change how we value the materials? So we were looking at it in terms of the mechanical properties, and most people that would be aware of pavement design would realize that it's been with us for about 50 years or more. And in the UK, the TRL, and in the US, the AASHTO trials, they looked at a road pavement and they trafficked them intensely with heavy vehicles to see how they would respond. And that's an empirical method. And it has, I suppose, an advantage in terms of it was quite simple. So it was just a matter of looking at an applied load and looking at a chart and seeing what the answer was. But what that ignored was it ignored the actual physical properties of the material itself, and it also ignored the environment in which it was situated. So there are influences, for example, from the weather. So from a very wet environment, a very hot environment. No, we don't actually get much change in Ireland, but we did look to see if we could do that. So next slide, please, Janet. So where are we with the IAPDM? At the moment, we've moved from what we would call level 1, which is described as empirical analysis of all the layers, to looking at a quasi-mechanistic empirical model, which is what we have developed at the moment. And I suppose really we have to bring it in phases, because we have to build up the confidence and we have to get the databases to see what changes we can make and how we can make them. And what we intend, we've already developed the model. We have a prototype of it, and we've applied it to the case study that I'll go on to in a few minutes. What we will next like to do is move from it being an empirical on the foundation layers to look at it and being mechanistic on the pavement layers. And finally, what we hope to evolve is to a mechanistic approach to all of the layers. Next slide, Janet, please. So what does the IAPDM do for us? It gives us the advantage that taking the material properties, we can reduce, we can reuse, and we can repurpose materials. Effectively, what we have is the one tool that can evaluate what the material can give to us as pavement designers. So what that will release is, it will release us in terms of being constrained with the types of materials that we use. So if we reuse a material, we can actually determine the value of that material to us. It will also foster innovation, because now we can look at other materials rather than restricting ourselves to a limited amount and a limited supply. And again, where we have materials that are local, but are performing to a higher level than we had expected, which is looking at it from purely from the empirical perspective, we can use that and harness that in terms of the benefits that we get from it. So if we look at it in terms of what the IAPDM will give us, it will give us a tool which will help us to gather data on the existing site conditions and how each of those layers will influence the next layer and influence the overall pavement. It will also look at information in terms of materials, and that's materials both on the upper pavement and on the foundations. And how do we express that? And this is something that we will come back to time and again, is how do we actually express the value of what we've done? And in the case of the example that we have, we can look at it in terms of tons of material saved. We can also look at it in terms of tons of carbon saved. So we're bringing in not just looking at it from an economic perspective, but we're also looking at it in terms of an environmental perspective. And of course, at the end of the day, if we can demonstrate a saving overall in the budget, that's an advantage as well. So next slide, Janet, please. So looking at the case study that we did, up on the top right-hand side, most people would be aware that if we're examining a pavement and we're looking at it in terms of its structural strength, we usually use the FWD, the falling weight deflectometer. And this is an output from the FWD when we went on to the project. At that stage, the capping layer had been finished. And you can see it's over about a 4-kilometer segment, what's on the screen. And you can see the very close alignment in terms of it being 2 lanes, lane 1 and lane 2, generally very well aligned, but there are some slight differences. And that's only just on adjacent lanes. But when you actually look at it over the 4 kilometers, you can see that in terms of the response around about chainage 3000, it's significantly different from that at 5,000. And what IAPDM allows us to do is it allows us to look at those differences and to put where we need to have additional strength to improve the lower layers, we can do that. But where we don't need to do it, we can actually save from that. So when we applied the model in the case study, you can see then on the right-hand side, over an 11-kilometer section, we were able to demonstrate that from the upper pavement layers, we could save approximately 30 millimeters. That might not seem like an awful lot, but over the volume that's there, that constituted a saving of about 830,000 euro. And when we looked at it in terms of carbon saving, and that's carbon just calculated in terms of the volume of material saved, that was of the order of about 600 tons of carbon. So next slide, Janet, please. We mentioned earlier on in terms of life cycle, and it's very important that when we look at the start of a project, we look at all the different phases. So when we're looking at life cycle, if we take it from a pavements perspective, there are a number of inputs, and if we break those down into, as I said at the very start of the presentation this evening, if you look at it in terms of economic, you look at it in terms of environment, and you look at it in terms of society, what are the key influences and what are the key drivers that, and what do we need to actually look at when we're evaluating it? So when we just simply look at the financial perspective, you can see that we not only have an agency cost, so how much does it cost to build it? How much does it cost to maintain it? We also are putting it there for society to use. So road users then will have to look at it and see, well, how long does it take them to travel? That's obviously a cost that we'd have to look at. The vehicle operating costs and accidents, all of those have to combine into a life cycle model to see what do we actually look at in terms of its whole life. So very often from a financial perspective, and if we were only just looking at a financial perspective, it may not always be the cheapest that will give us the best value over the life cycle. And again, this is in terms of the language that we're trying to develop in this, we're trying to look at what is not just the cost of it, but what is the value of it. So again, you can see from the environmental perspective, we have influences in terms of the phases of the asset. So it's when we actually produce the asset, the materials that it takes to build it, in terms of its operation and in terms of its maintenance. And finally, if we're looking at it in terms of a societal value, how do we actually measure that? And if we look maybe to, again, benchmark what has happened elsewhere, particularly in Europe, typically we're looking at the likes of values in terms of noise, air quality, in terms of maybe accessibility. So these are all the aspects that we need to consider in terms of a life cycle tool. And you can see from the very simple example of a pavement, it is quite complex, and we need to look at these over its entire life cycle to be able to look at it and say we've got the best value. So back to you, Janet.
Thanks very much, Tom. So the second pilot project that we're looking at is implementation of a circular economy plan in light rail. So 3 phases are shown on the slide, and the first phase, development of the template for a light rail project, has been in development for a year now. So it sets out the visions and goals of circular economy for a light rail project. It aligns with the RAMS approach, and it sets out a clear vision for circular economy in light rail projects. Some strategies that might be considered depending on your project would be design for deconstruction and adaptability, and resource efficiency principles, for example. At this stage, workshop templates for phase 2 might be developed. Cross-cutting themes throughout the 3 phases are identifying the benefits of a circular economy approach and the interventions you're considering. The importance of integration with design, the importance of data gathering, evidence-based approaches, consideration of assets and infrastructure, so during maintenance and operation, and integration during the operational phase. During phase 2, the project-specific design opportunities would be identified using workshops with design teams. Further development of the business case, for example, would take place, and a project-specific circular economy statement is the output at that stage. During phase 3, integration takes place. So you're integrating with your design team, with the BIM approach, for example, that might be taken on a light rail project. Your business case will be finalized, and it will be a stakeholder engagement, including handover to the design team for implementation would take place. So the output would be an integrated approach, and that would be integrated into the asset register for the scheme, which would allow the data regarding each asset within the light rail system to be handed over to the operations team. And then at end of life, this data would be available so that maximum utility and the highest value could be maintained for all of the assets within the light rail system.
So moving on to what that would look like then on a road project. It's very similar to a light rail planning project. So phase 4, just to mention, is the stages that we do in the development of the planning of a road project, from inception through to bringing it through to the planning process and getting statutory approval to build a road. So the first phase that we did in terms of developing that as a pilot project on a phase 1 to 4 is to come up with a template that we could use to illustrate the clear vision and benefits of implementing a circular economy on a project, and thinking about what zero waste is going to look like, what zero carbon is going to look like, and how we bring regenerative design into the early planning stage of our projects, and then to have a template that we can roll out onto projects. And then what we will move on to now is looking at what the scheme-specific opportunities are on the project, and we're doing design team workshops at the moment. And it is really interesting, and looking at the planning phase of a project, looking at how, where there is an existing national road, can we reuse that existing national road? What can we do to get the most out of that and make sure that its reuse is considered? And if it can't be reused, if it just isn't going to be able to give us the capacity that we need, what are the things that we can do in terms of looking for the potential that the old road or the existing road network in the area, that we maximize the potential of modal shift on that road, so that the new asset, if it needs to be built, has to serve the least demand possible and therefore uses the least amount of materials. And this gets us into the interesting thing of that circular economy. The business case can become much more interesting. It also brings up the opportunities of regenerative design, so that as we look at improving a section of the road network, we can maybe make it better than what was there before, not just in terms of the quality of people's journeys, but in the terms of the quality of life of people around, and not just the quality of life of people, but things like biodiversity. Maybe we can use the existing road more intensively from a biodiversity point of view, for example. And then as we get into more detailed design, how can we integrate this circular economy approach with BIM, engage with wider stakeholders, so those mutual gains that I've spoken about in terms of local communities and biodiversity can be better understood, and that is then handed over to the design team and be implemented. Back to you, Janet.
So a literature review was undertaken to inform the draft circular economy plans for TI, and this is some of the international best practice that we came across when creating the templates. So for example, the publication of circular economy statements for High Speed 2, and the use of circular economy plans for major infrastructure at a draft stage by the Mayor of London in the UK. So what are the next steps in terms of creation of the TI circular economy plan? So we've just embarked on phase 2 of the plan creation, and we're undertaking systems mapping of the ecosystem and the actors and stakeholders that along the TII, a roadmap from a linear to a circular approach. We're mapping materials management and creating a framework for enhanced data gathering so that circular initiatives and the improvements that they bring about can be measured and value capture opportunities identified. A circularity tool will be developed in line with the slide that Tom showed earlier to consider the 3 pillars, which is financial value, environmental value, and social value, and template circular economy plans for projects, and the learnings from the pilot projects will be scaled up and implemented on projects. So this is just a more detailed slide showing each of the tasks undertaken at each stage of the project. So we're in phase 2 at the moment on pilot projects, as I mentioned, and that will take us up to autumn, and when there'll be consultation on the objectives set out in the plan, and following consultation, dissemination of the plan. So in phase 1, there was an international best practice review and engagement. Phase 2 will include further engagement and the learnings from pilot projects and creation of a draft plan, which will lead on then to the consultation in the autumn. And this slide shows one of the key deliverables, I suppose, in terms of the project, which is a template for circular economy plans for projects. The strategy would align with TII phases, strategic project planning phases. Designs and consents would take you up to planning. And at construction and handover, the idea would be that the as-built would be handed over from the construction stage to the operation, allowing data to be used to maximize the maintenance of the asset, and at its end of life to maximize its utility. Workshops are used throughout the project at a strategy stage to identify the most beneficial circular strategies for the project, at design and consent stage to identify specific circular opportunities. And tools that are used are, for example, materials registers, design workshop aids, design for disassembly checklists, and material passport type handover at the end of construction. The level of detail will increase as the plan progresses, and it's proposed that there'd be 3 versions of it: a strategic version, a project circular economy plan, and an as-built circular economy plan. I think that's it from us. So thank you so much for your attention. And I suppose that's any questions, I suppose, is the next.
Thank you very much, Janet. So if you have any questions too, if you could put them into the Q&A section, please. I think you might be getting off lightly tonight. 1 second now. Donald, do you want to? You're on mute, Donald.
Sorry, thanks, Dennis. Thanks for that. Yeah, I'll just jump in there, maybe steer the ship for a while and give you a break. Look, many thanks. That was a fabulous presentation to my colleague Tom and Janet and Mike. I think there's a hell of a lot of moving parts in such an interesting topic. So the questions are flying in here now, so we might just pass through them. So there's a question there from Gurpreet, looking at carbon reduction, any considerations given to using recyclable plastic materials for pavement construction?
Well, I suppose when we've looked at the introduction of the IAPDM, what we can do is we can take materials and look at the different constituent parts and see what benefits they will give us. Certainly within Ireland, we haven't recycled plastic into it, but we have actually examples where we have recycled the old pavement. And we also have an example going back quite a number of years. We recycled some glass into the pavement. So I suppose really in terms of recycling a material, what we will be trying to do is making sure that we get its best and its maximum value from it. And that would be not just simply from a road perspective, but it would also be, I would imagine, from other industries. So if plastic is more beneficial to the plastics industry, then that's probably where the first port of call should be. If it can be of benefit to us, the advantage of the PDM is that we can actually measure what that advantage is. Whether or not that's sustainable within the long term, there would probably need to be a little bit more research on that.
Okay, thanks for that, Tom. Moving on there to Sean has a question there. How do you identify products and material for creation of the material passport?
Maybe if I look at that again in terms of what we mean by a material passport, very often, and if you take it from the pavement perspective, when we're recycling, it's a great advantage to know what the original constituent materials were, particularly if we're looking at the binder, whether or not it was a polymer modified binder. So polymer modified binders wouldn't be as easily recycled as straight run bitumen. So once we know all the details of what went in, where it came from and what it did, then we can actually then look at that in the future to see how we can reuse that material. And as I said, try and extract its maximum benefit from it.
And then maybe extending that out beyond the area of pavement, that extends into all of the road makeup. So you've got your bridge. If you we're in a situation where you're demolishing the bridge, we can see in the Netherlands where there's a clear plan of how you would reuse beams. You can see that in you can imagine a road drainage situation. If you get into a reconstruction of your road in the future, how do you know what the pipe that is in the road, what's its constituency, and then to what standard was it manufactured, when it was manufactured? We're going to need that information in our BIM model so that we can have the passport information to take that out and make sure that it's used to the highest extent possible.
Okay, and then the next question is, what barriers are there to the reuse of materials on projects?
I can take that one, I suppose. The data around them and the flow of data is very important, as Tom mentioned. So it's not just the properties of the materials, but also the environmental impacts that they have. So I think a wider adoption of environmental product declarations, for example, would allow the properties of materials in reuse, particularly EPDs for recycled materials, to be considered and comparisons made between them. And then it would be easier for the benefits of recycled materials, I think, to become evident. So the life cycle assessment through the use of adoption of EPDs would be beneficial, I think, in that regard.
Okay, thanks, Janet. There's a question there from Keith. It's probably already covered in the presentation, and in fairness, like there's no one from the government on the presentation, but anyhow, but it's just how committed is the government to supporting the concept of cheapest and not necessarily best value?
That's a very good question. I suppose, I mean, if we take a look at it in terms of procurement, anybody that knows how we would procure, say, for example, a service, we procure a service on the basis of most economically advantageous tender. So I suppose the concept is already there, maybe on a lesser scale. So I think, again, if we can use the case studies to prove what the benefits actually are, not just in terms of short term, but life cycle, I'd certainly, what we can see from the program for government is that they are committed to looking at this green procurement perspective.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Moving on there to EFW plants in Ireland currently produce circa 180,000 tonnes per annum of bottom ash. This is currently reused in construction projects in Europe. Are there any plans to seek similar opportunities in Ireland for using this waste?
Well, maybe if I again look at that from TII's perspective, if anyone is familiar with our 900 series, we do have on our 800 as well. We do have products in there which we call low energy bound, and a lot of our low energy bound materials would have as part of their constituent at the moment cement. So I would imagine that this is and it has been used elsewhere in Europe as a substitute for that. So what we have done, we've had a number of projects over the years where we have recycled the pavement, and we've used cement in terms of improving the characteristics of the in situ material. So it would have, I suppose, a benefit, but we have to look at it as well, again, in terms of life cycle. And part of the aspect that Janet talked about was cradle to cradle. We can also look at cradle to gate. So they're called PCRs, which is a product category rules. So how do we actually measure that? So if we're looking at it in terms of, well, where is this material? So is it easily transferred, say, from, I'm presuming at the moment it's probably on the East Coast, if we have a project that's on the West Coast. So we can then look at the energy that's needed to bring that over in terms of the transportation. So this is where we're looking at it in terms of looking at it at a life cycle cost. So we have to look at all the different aspects and see which actually gives us the best benefit. So nothing actually ruled in, but at the same time, it has to when we put in a set of rules and guidelines, it has to be demonstrable that it is of a benefit.
Okay, thanks for that, Tom, and thanks for that question, Sean. Next question from David: is there any plans to introduce mandatory requirements for recycling all existing road pavement materials and to prohibit disposal as a waste?
I can take that one. Not in the short term. I wouldn't think, because the supply would need to be considered in the industry, and the number of plants supplying recycled road pavement to the standards and specifications that are required by TII would need to be in place. So in the short term, it simply wouldn't be possible with the infrastructure that's available to do that. And I think that's an admirable long-term goal for circular economy in Ireland. But TII are, one of their key aims of the circular economy plan is working with their supply chain to achieve it as an aim. But in the short term, it just, as I said, it just simply wouldn't be possible.
Maybe just to add to that, I suppose at the moment, if we look at it in terms of a road pavement, and you mentioned in the question waste, it's not actually considered as a waste. So it, as I said, the objective would be to reuse it in its most beneficial form. So if it is, for example, a bituminous pavement, ideally we would want to regenerate that bitumen and see if we can actually extract the benefit of the remaining life of the bitumen in a new bituminous layer. And our current 900 series does allow for the use of recycled materials up to, I think it's about 15%, without having to look at in terms of demonstrating the benefits. So it is already there in terms of its reuse. However, if the quality of that feedstock is such that the bitumen is hardened to an extent that it can no longer be rejuvenated, then essentially what you have is what they call in the UK a black aggregate. And the material can be used, but it would be used most likely as a sub-base, or it could be used as a capping material as well. So in terms of it being a waste, it wouldn't in its present format be considered as a waste. it should be reused, and it can be reused within the pavement structure.
Yeah, thanks for that. Next question from Martin. Has TI measured potential benefits from deferring spend using asset management and condition styles, example IA, PDM and pavements? In broad terms, what percentage of program budget could you save on Project Ireland 2040 projects?
Well, I suppose if anyone's aware in terms of our asset management, we did bring in a pavement management system. And what we were able to demonstrate with that pavement management system is that we had a number of interventions. So if we could identify the condition that the pavement was in, the ideal condition that we wanted to bring it back to, which is its reset level, we could then look and see what the cost of that would be. But obviously, when we look at our network, there's a greater need than I suppose the funds that are available to us. So what our pavement management system does for us is it looks at a number of scenarios and it optimizes those scenarios against the constraints that are there. And one of the constraints that would be there would be quite obviously the budget. So what we can look at is we've tiered it in terms of a number of interventions, and those interventions could be from simply a resurfacing to a strengthening to a complete reconstruction. So we can actually build that in and we can see, but again, very much along the lines of it depends what the constraints of the system actually are.
Thanks for that, Tom. Next question from Nicholas. Are there implications for road schemes which are currently being prepared for statutory approval, say in 2022, in terms of having considered this approach?
I think that in terms of schemes that have been brought to planning at the moment, all schemes being presented at hearing are to comply with national policy. So a typical scheme going through an EAR process will set that out in detail. I think that what we need to do is that we do need to anticipate in the planning of projects that will be delivered in planning in years to come, what is the future direction of planning and policy, so that we can anticipate that the projects that we're designing now comply with those policies in due course.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Question from Graham then, is there any source of recommendations on percentage recycled asphalt and other materials for non-TI products in the interim while the strategy is progressing?
Well, that's really a question in terms of the specification. And again, as most people would be aware, that TII specification is used more widely than the national road projects. We've also contributed to the national standard. So SR28, which the NSAI developed, and that was in conjunction with a team from industry and from government departments and from academia. So we developed SR28, which is very, very close to what we have in TII. Some of the constraints that are there would be obviously in terms of the processing of the material. And because of the need to dry out the material and to be able to rejuvenate the bitumen, there is would be generally agreed as throughout industry as a constraint. So most plants would have a capacity to take not much more than 30%. I definitely know there is one plant in Ireland that can go to much higher levels. That's got a twin drum system, but it is only the one plant. But generally, any of the coating plants that are there would take up to about 30%. Again, we are, I suppose, constrained by Europe, and we have SEN standards. And one of those requirements for SEN standards is a declaration of the performance of the product. And that would mean to say that the constituents, and if the constituents are included as a recycled material, they would have to be declared. And there is actually a SEN standard in terms of recycled asphalt. So there are a lot of sources that are out there at the moment in terms of how we can apply recycled materials into new materials.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Thanks for Graham for that. Next question then is from John. Where did the motivation for this initiative come from on TII's part, from central government or from the TII board or internally?
Might take that one. So I think at the start of the presentation, Janet set out the various national policies that lead us to see that circular economy is something that we should be implementing. And then Tom set out as well is that from the board of TII, you can see in their statement of strategy that sustainability is a central driver for TII. I would say that when we would compare TII comparatively internationally, TII is a progressive organization that is embracing the concepts of sustainability. And I think with the publication of this recent strategy, you will see much more information coming through on that over the course of the next several months. And then I would add that to that is that as we engage with the people who work in TII and their stakeholders in terms of the road authorities that implement the projects, we find great engagement on this subject, great enthusiasm to adopt these principles and implement them and make them work. The idea of having better outcomes for society, delivering projects that use less material whilst delivering better value, I think is something that myself and Janet's personal experience of working with the people in TII on this, there's a huge amount of buy-in into that, quite enthusiastic, and that has hugely helped us in the delivery and devising the concepts that we've shown you this evening.
Okay, thanks, Mike. The next question then is from Martin. When considering a reuse of existing pavement, how would one weigh off the balancing of passing opportunities or similar design criteria in relation to carbon reduction? Is there a rule of thumb, or would traditional design criteria take precedent over carbon reduction?
Well, maybe not to harbour too much in terms of recycling. There certainly are well-defined methodologies of calculating as Janet showed, it's an assessment of what would be called cradle to gate. So how much carbon does it need to produce a particular type of product? And that will depend on the constituent materials. And if the constituent material is either a recycled material or is a secondary aggregate, as we saw earlier on in terms of the ash content from the recycling or the I think it was one of the earlier questions. If we look at the constituent products, then we can actually calculate the carbon input, and we can then see what benefits we get from it.
Thanks, Tom. Next question then is climate change a specific consideration in the design process?
I'll start with that one in the first instance. Any scheme that is going into the planning process requiring AR in the data necessary to assess the impact of the scheme is going to need to present the information on climate. Typically AR will include information on climate. So in that way, it's most definitely part of the design process.
Okay. Next question from Bertie. In relation to procurement, are there plans to provide guidance in relation to how objective and transparent award criteria can be built into tenders for both works contracts and goods?
I think the various different government policies that were introduced at the beginning of the presentation all emphasize the importance of green public procurement and the need to update the green public procurement guidance for the public sector documents. So I think that's something that's coming down the tracks as indicated by the National Waste Action Plan, where it says that mandatory inclusion of green criteria in all public purchasing will happen, but it hasn't set out a date for that. So part of that process will be guidance on award criteria. I don't know if Tom wants to comment on that as well. So all three of the strategy statements, the programme for government, and then the EU Circular Economy Action Plan and the National Waste Action Plan for a Circular Economy all emphasise the need for guidance on green public procurement and that it will be coming to follow.
Thanks, Janet. Next question then from Sam. Could a CE assessment result in the reallocation of existing road pavements or alignments to other transport modes instead of new road construction?
I think a CE assessment would ensure that that consideration has taken place in terms of applying circular economy principles. If you're a bit of an anorak like me at looking at how road schemes are developing, if you go on the various consultation sites for the different phase 1 to 4 projects that are going on around the country, you can see is that the public transport alternative on road is now routinely brought into consideration as the options are brought through into phase 2. So I think that's already part of the process, and circular economy procedures are about making sure that happens in terms of reducing material usage.
Okay, thanks, Mike. A question from Jack: how would the introduction of more collaborative procurement options assist in the implementation of the circular economy plan?
I think it can only be beneficial. If you look at, we're involved in some tenders in the Netherlands, for example, where they're circular and they're developed in consultation with the roads authority there because they're innovative tenders. So TII has a similar process, so I think they go hand in hand. Tom would like to, I guess, comment on that also.
Collaborative procurement. I'm not quite sure what you mean by collaborative procurement. I know that we had a system before where we had centralized procurement, and that meant to say that you had bigger volume. So if you got a bigger volume, you would have expected more discount. If that's what you mean, I'm not quite sure that would be something that would have an influence. If we're looking at it in terms of collaborative and looking at the different entities that would be involved in it, in terms of whether or not we'd say, for example, look at bringing new systems like early contractor involvement within the process. Well, what that then would mean to say is that we might get a wider experience and a wider expertise in at an earlier stage, which would help us at a later stage. But I think, as Mike has shown, what we need to look at it is in terms of life cycle. So it's not just the cost of actually producing the asset, but it's also the cost of maintaining the asset and renewing it at the end of its life. So that then does bring into question maybe what type of partners do you need to bring into it, and when do you need to bring them in. So it's probably a bit more extensive than simply just looking at it in terms of bulk buying, so to speak.
We're nearly there. I think we've got, if Dennis is okay with the time, I was going to, yeah, we'll chat through the last 3 questions there. So Keith has asked, going back to the initial question, do we need to build this at all? Is TII reevaluating transport demand projections in light of the new normal of likely increased working from home in the post-COVID-19 era?
I'll take that one. I mean, TII, certainly if you go on TII's website, you can see a lot of information about the change in traffic patterns we've seen over the last few months. What COVID has done is it has clearly accelerated all our thinking in what we can do in terms of remote working. And that technology change is definitely going to be part of the transport pattern in the future. It's too early to say what the permanent change will be. So, for example, if you look at the Irish Times today, there's an article in there about, you know, how much of the working at home will continue, and how much, and what are the issues if employers can embrace working at home, and what issues do they have to manage. So we do need to carefully observe what that looks like. but obviously it's clearly part of what the long-term trend is. There are other really important transport trends as well, one of which we've had in national policy for quite a while now is compact growth, and how compact growth and modal shift can contribute to change as well. So that it is part of a mix of the evolution of transport.
Okay, pretty done there now. So question from Brian with respect to the response on reuse of material. Is an Article 28 approval required from the EPA to permit this? I don't know if anybody's in a position to answer that question here today, are they?
I think the Article 28 process is just a massively important part to play in the recycling industry in Ireland. So the National Waste Strategy that was published in September made commitments to work with stakeholders to seek national end of waste criteria for priority waste streams. And I think construction and demolition waste streams are key in that, in those actions they've set out in relation to Article 28. Streamlining the process has also been recently undertaken by the EPA with the publication of their draft Article 28 new guidelines. So I think it's got a massively important part to play. Some materials will fall under Article 27 depending on their properties and the circumstances of their reuse and their processing. Some will fall under Article 28, and that's a dependent on many factors. There's rules for Article 27 and there's rules for Article 28. I think what's to be welcomed is the action set out in the national strategy published in September. And it seems that DCCAE and the EPA all want to work towards a more streamlined approach. So adoption of more Article 28s and Article 27s can only be beneficial. But as regards which would apply in which circumstance and which material, the rules that apply in different circumstances will be case specific. So it will be very much dependent on the 4 rules that apply for Article 27 and the set of rules set out by the EPA in their publication on that Article 28 application for that specific material and that specific use. So we wouldn't be in a position to comment on one specific case. It wouldn't be appropriate without considering all the different factors.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. The last question then from Timothy. Does more emphasis need to be attributed to testing subformation or formation?
Absolutely, that's what the mechanistic approach involves. It looks at the mechanical response of the various layers, and that includes the foundations and the formation.
Okay, very good. Right now, just one final question. I think that's just the last one. The last one from Joe. Should PSV requirements be reduced to aid circular economy strategy?
That's a very interesting question. You must have been looking at some of my research. If you're familiar with our documentation, we've actually changed our skid resistance policy, and we've changed in terms of how we're assessing the materials, because what we're actually looking at now is to try and bring it to looking at, and it's very much along the circular economy perspective, to see if we can look at demand and supply. So we have a number of projects that we're looking at in terms of friction demand, and then how we can respond to those in terms of friction supply. We have done some case studies as well on that in terms of developing the policy. And there is one trial that we actually have at the moment where we had a very high friction demand, and in terms of mitigating it, what we actually tried to do is to reduce the demand. And how we did that was we put in a cautionary speed limit. So generally, the higher the speed, the higher demand for friction, but also the higher the speed, the lower the supply of friction. So if we can actually reduce speed, we can then get a better balance between supply and demand. So it is something that we're actively working on at the moment.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, look, that's I think 25 questions answered. Probably 4 or 5 of them were just thank yous and congratulations on the great presentation. So I think we've got through about 20 questions there, which is excellent. Before I hand back to Dennis, I'd just like to congratulate the speakers on the job well done. It's a fabulous presentation, and express my sincere thanks to Secretary of Civil Division and to Tom, obviously, who's a colleague of mine in TII. And then also just to say thanks to the attendees for the very, very stimulating and interesting questions that were posed to make the session very enjoyable for my part. Anyhow, so I'll pass back over to yourself now, Dennis.